Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Sprues. In today's video we're going to do a build and review of the Airfix Vintage Classic 1/72 scale Brewster Buffalo. So I actually finished this kit quite a while ago, and I've also done an inbox review of it and two other 72nd scale Brewster Buffalo kits, including the Hasegawa one back there. And when I started this kit, I was actually pretty sick. I'd spent 3 days beforehand in bed pretty much, unable to do anything. And when I did finally get out, I had a good week or so of brain fog and like a bit of a weird dizziness. So I sort of wanted a nice easy build for while I was recovering, and one that I wouldn't put too much pressure on myself doing. And I decided to go with this one because it's a little bit older and rather basic, but a good little challenge, and I thought it would be relatively simple. So without further ado, let's see how I went with building this one. To begin with, I give the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil and residue from the moulds, and then I cut the lower wings from the sprues and sand the edges to remove any remaining burr marks from the sprues or any seam lines. The instructions called for adding the observation window in, but I wanted to do that a little bit later to make painting easier, so I instead removed it from the sprue and then cut away the trim on the outside of it so I could later install it from the outside. I continued to cut out the fuselage halves, cockpit floor, and both upper wings from the sprues, and sand away any seam lines or excess sprue. I glued the upper and lower wing halves together, which fitted with a bit of a gap on the underside, and used some bulldog clips to hold them together while they bonded. I installed the basic cockpit floor to the wings that's included in the kit, and cleaned up the seat before gluing it into place. It seemed a little bit disappointing to have a lack of cockpit with the kit having such nice clear parts, so I decided to spend a little bit of time to scratch build a very basic interior. I used some sheets of evergreen 1mm polystyrene to make up some instrument panels, and a small section of evergreen H-beam styrene was cut to make the rails for the rudder pedals to sit on. I bent some florist wire and removed some of the excess rubber coating on it to make the joystick, and some 1mm thick Tamiya masking tape was added to the sidewalls of the cockpit to create some internal ribbing. I glued my two H-beams to another piece of polystyrene to make up the floor frame, and added some cut up spare FW190 steps to make basic rudder pedals. I did a bit of cutting of excess plastic from the fuselage halves to help fit my new details a little bit better, and then I glued the new floor section and joystick into place. Some extra styrene was glued to the sidewalls of the cockpit to add detailing, and then I gave the landing gear bay and the cockpit 3 coats of Tamiya Xf-71Cockpit Green. In between applying coats of the interior green, I started working on the engine. I removed it from the sprues and started to clean up the rather awkwardly placed sprue attachments and the massive amount of flashing that was present between the cylinder heads. Some of the wiring didn't form correctly in the moulding process, so I had to replace it with some thin pieces of copper wire from jewellery making sets. I started to cut out the parts that made up the engine cowling and applied a final coat of interior green on the, interior, and then I gave the engine a coat of Xf-16 flat aluminium. With the interior base colour finally dry and completed, I started to pick out details with Vallejo flat black, mainly on things like my added instrument panels and some parts of the control column. I paint a second coat of flat aluminium on the engine, and add some flat white instrument dials, which were then cleaned up with some more flat black. Finally, I painted the engine controls Vermilion Red and flat yellow, before painting the central part of the engine Xf-24 dark grey, and wiring on the engine flat black. Xf-16 flat aluminium was once again used, this time to add some interior chipping, and then both the engine and interior parts received a coat of Tamiya black panel liner scent to highlight their details. Once the panel liner dried, I then removed the excess using some enamel thinners and a cotton bud. I decided to also add some seat belts using the Tamiya 1mm masking tape, which I painted Vallejo buff. With the interior improved enough to my personal liking, I then glued the fuselage halves together and let the glue bond for a few minutes, with a bulldog clip and a bit of tape holding the halves tightly together. They both fitted alright, so I proceeded to then glue the fuselage floor and wings to the bottom of them, which fitted alright as well. I then removed the horizontal stabilizers from the sprue and glued them to the rear of the fuselage, and removed the masking tape from around the fuselage halves. Although I have heard the Commonwealth operated Buffaloes didn't have the canister for the life raft, the instructions still specified several parts for the naval version only, but they did not specify to leave this out for the land-based version. So I decided to just go with the instructions and put it in. After all, I'm sure my pilot would be glad to have a life raft right behind his head as he tries to dogfight the Japanese over the waters around Singapore. Next, I assemble the rather fiddly landing gear. The parts were a bit tricky to assemble, but I managed to find that if you attach the smaller strut coming from the fuselage first and then attach the much thicker outboard one, then you can join them together a lot more easily. I did some sanding with a file to remove the seam lines from the underside of the fuselage before attaching the land-based option tail wheel and giving the main wheels a sand and gluing them into place along with the wheel hubs. I then attached some sections of the front cowling which didn't really fit too nicely to the fuselage, but with a little bit of fiddling I managed to get them into place. With most of the assembly completed except for some smaller fragile parts and the engine, I started to fill in any gaps and nasty sink marks with a little bit of Vallejo water-based putty. The kit had quite a few gaps, especially around where the cowling joined to the fuselage halves and on the underside of the wings. I also had to fill in the tailhook area that's present on the land-based aircraft. Once the putty had dried, I then sanded it down off camera and moved on to modifying the front cowling, which only had recessed details for some of the air intakes. So I decided to improve these by drilling them out using my rotary tool and then cleaning up the edges with my knife. By now the kit was finally ready for some painting. I wanted to do a RAAF scheme, and fortunately I had some spare decals for an aircraft from 453 Squadron, which was based in Singapore during 1941. Not a very good year to be there for the Commonwealth, as it turned out. Apart from the early war black underside half for identification, this scheme is pretty much identical to the one featured in the kit for the aircraft from Rangoon, so I painted it with the same colours I normally would use for RAAF colours. Starting off with the lightest colour, which in this case would be sky for the undersides. I used Tamiya Xf-71, which was thinned down with some water and then applied in the same direction as air would flow as much as possible to help reduce any brush strokes. While the first coat of sky dried, I painted the lightest colour on the upper surface, which was Xf-52 Flat Earth, in pretty much the exact same fashion. Notice how you can still see a lot of the colour of the plastic showing through after the first coat of the flat earth and the sky. This is because I keep my layers nice and thin, which helps the surface detail show through and also reduces the chances of any visible brush strokes. It's better to build up several layers of paint rather than trying to do all of the painting in 2 or 3 coats. After I applied a second coat of flat earth and sky, which as you can see makes it a lot more uniform, I then added the second layer on the upper surface, which was the darker Xf-71 RAAF Dark Green number 2. This time I created the outline for the camouflage shapes, and then gradually filled them in, trying again as much as possible to apply the paint in the same direction, and keeping it nice and thin with the water so that the details wouldn't be hidden and paint marks wouldn't be shown, but also making sure it wasn't so thin that it would run out of control. A third coat of flat earth was then carefully applied around the RAAF green to neaten up any mistakes I'd made, followed by a second coat of green, and then the left underside half of the aircraft and the tyres on the wheels were painted a thin coat of Vallejo flat black. I did some touch-ups with the Xf-71 to neaten up any mistakes or runs that I'd accidentally created on the underside of the aircraft, especially on the area around the wheels where I'd painted the tyres. I do a final fourth coat of RAAF green and the flat earth, before then painting the Xf-71's sky band on the rear fuselage with a fine brush. The interior of the engine cowling, inside the wheel wells, and some of the unpainted surfaces of the cockpit received a few coats of interior green, and then the glare shield around the main instrument panel was painted flat black. In all of the pictures I've seen of Buffaloes, they appear to have a sort of roll cage positioned behind the pilot, so I decided to add one in using some thin florist wire bent to the shape of the frames and then glued into place. While the frames dried, I repaired my deformed propeller blade with a cut-off piece of spare donor blade, which I got out of my Hasegawa Buffalo kit. The spinner was then glued over the prop and the engine installed to the airframe, and while that dried I painted the frame for the roll cage and some of the landing gear struts a bright Vallejo silver. I'd seen several pictures of Buffaloes with what looks like a sheet of bare metal around the exhaust, so I decided to try and replicate this by painting some Vallejo natural steel around the exhaust area. After I'd painted the steel, I then neatened the edges up with some flat earth and some RAAF green. The propeller blades were then painted black, and with the area around the exhausts dry, I now painted the exhausts themselves a coat of X31 Titan Gold. The spinner of the propeller was painted Xf-71 Sky, and the head cushion Vallejo Chocolate Brown, and once the propellers had received a few more coats, it was time for some decals. As I mentioned, I had some old aftermarket decals lying around, so I decided to use all of them and save the roundels from the nicer cartograph sheets in this kit for another time. Now, I will admit, I was a bit lazy when I made this kit and didn't bother to do a gloss coat before adding the decals, which is normally fine with the quality of cartograph decals, but it resulted in some rather nasty silvering in some spots on these aftermarket decals, which weren't of as good a quality. Nevertheless, I proceeded to hold the decals in some warm water for a few seconds, and then carefully slide them into place on the model, and once they were all in place, I gave them a dab of Vallejo decal softener, followed by some Tamiya decal adhesive to make the decals more malleable and help them sink into the raised details of the model, giving them a nice painted on effect. I left the decals to dry for about 24 hours, and in the meantime turned my attention to the canopy frame. I started by painting the raised areas on the frames their interior colour of Xf-71 Interior Green, very carefully picking the raised areas out with a fine brush. I like to paint my clear parts first with a coat of the colour that would be for the inside of the frames, because this will show through given that they are transparent, saving having to try and paint the inside where there's no raised details to help guide your brush. After the interior colours had dried, I then painted the exterior colours for the frame. Flat earth was used for the exterior colour on the main canopy frame, while the observation window on the underside was painted half sky and half black to match the underside of the fuselage. To neaten up any mistakes, I carefully scratch away any excess paint from the canopies with a cocktail stick, and then I painted the large antenna for the front of the aircraft flat earth, and glued a small piece of clear card into the place where the gun sight would be as a little bit of extra detail, followed by the two main canopy frames and the observation window. I decided, however, to leave the main canopy section off that would slide so that I could access the cockpit to put in and take out a pilot. I then carefully paint over any areas where the paint got slightly damaged from gluing the mast and the canopies into place, and after doing this, I gave the model a coat of matte varnish to help protect the decals and also make the surface nice and uniform, giving the decals a painted on effect. I painted the tips of the unvarnished propeller blades yellow, and then after waiting overnight for the varnish to dry on the rest of the aircraft, I then began the weathering process. Although the Buffaloes did see service in the Pacific, which is famously a harsh climate, they weren't really operational for too long, and I observed in almost every picture of them, in the Commonwealth at least, they had pretty minimal weathering. So I decided to challenge myself a little by keeping my weathering very light. I started off with the usual metal chipping, focusing it on areas around the cowling, the exposed leading edges of the wings, around the walkway and canopy, and also a bit on the access hatches along the wings where the ammunition was. I'd seen a few pictures showing some light wear in these spots, and they are generally quite vulnerable due to air resistance and also general operation from the crew. The edges of the propeller blades that would be exposed to the airflow were also slightly chipped, and then to tone the entire effect down and give it a more layered effect, I went back over the areas I'd chipped with the base colour and dabbed a little bit of it around the edges of the chipping. With the chipping done, I then added some anti-slip walkways using some 3mm Tamiya masking tape, which I then painted black. I then got out my Tamiya Weathering Master powders and used some of the black powder to add a very subtle amount of exhaust smoke streaking back from the two exhausts, and also a little bit of gun smoke from the two ports around the cowling. Some sand and mud pigments were gently brushed onto the walkways and also a bit onto the tyres to add a little bit of a layered dirt effect. To create some subtle streaking effects, I applied some Tamiya panel liner to some of the areas around the cowling and the landing gear, and then I streaked it backwards using some enamel thinners to give some subtle streaks. In some areas I also rubbed away the excess with a cotton tip. The aircraft itself was now completed, but this time I decided to also include in this video painting the pilot. I decided to paint him roughly to resemble a RAAF pilot in a tropical uniform at the time. I painted his uniform a coat of Vallejo buff, followed by some chocolate brown for his shoes, which I would later change to flat black, saddle brown for his helmet, flat yellow for the Mae West life jacket, and a bit of flat flesh for his, his flesh. I did about 3 coats of each colour, picking out his details, and if I made any mistakes, I'd neaten up by following it up with another coat of paint. Once I had a nice solid colour, I painted his mask and goggles with some flat black, then dabbed a little bit of silver onto the transparent areas on his goggles, and gave him a coat of black panel liner scent to highlight all his details and darken him up a bit. I removed a little bit of the excess panel liner away as it dried in a few spots, and once he'd dried, my Vintage Classic Airfix Buffalo was finally completed. And here you can see the final result. This kit obviously is quite old and basic, and it definitely shows this in some areas. The kit also seems to be a bit inaccurate, especially in terms of the Navy and the land-based variants, with some different parts for them being specified but others such as the life raft and the observation window not being mentioned. Another issue I have is the instructions don't show you how to assemble the landing gear in the retracted position. Instead you have to just guess, and there are a few extra landing gear parts, which I think is a bit annoying. Although I'd never really build my aircraft with the gear retracted, I know that a lot of people do, and I'd imagine that would be quite a pain to have to try and guess how to build it. Worst of all though, it seems to me that Airfix had a real quality slip in their kits, at least at the time this kit seems to have been made. I had the parts for my propeller and some of the wires for the engine not even mould properly, and there was also a lot of flash, which is not something I'd expect from Airfix. I have also since watched a few other videos where people have been reviewing Airfix kits from a similar time frame, and some found similar moulding defects and had to contact Airfix for replacement parts. I was fortunate I could fix the engine and also replace the propeller blade with the spare one from the Hasegawa kit, because being in Australia, getting spares from Airfix is an absolute pain, as it usually takes an incredibly long time. Despite those points, and some rather poor choices in decal application leading to some silvering, I have to say, on the whole, I got a lot of enjoyment out of making this kit, and at least for me personally, that's something I really value in a model. It just seems like the perfect not too complex kit to build with a few little extra mods here and there, and at the time it gave me something to do when I was feeling really yucky. I think simply adding a few bits of wire and styrene have tremendously improved the cockpit area, but fortunately you also have a decent pilot if you wish to just simply block out the lack of detail that way. The Buffalo is a bit of an unrepresented aircraft in my opinion, and although it suffered a lot in the Pacific theatre, this was probably more due to the circumstances and a few poor choices rather than an inherent flaw in its design. But despite that, it has a lot of character, which I think this kit captures really well, and if you want to tell the story about what the early days for the Commonwealth and the US Navy was like in the Pacific theatre, then I think this plane perfectly represents the early failures, and shows just how far the Allies had to go before they could face the Japanese with equal and superior aircraft and strategies. So by no means is this a perfect kit, and I suspect the Hasegawa Buffalo is going to be a lot better, but I still enjoyed it, and if you're happy paying $25 and doing a little bit of work, I think you can still get a pretty decent kit out of this one, and it definitely captures the spirit of the Buffalo, so I could very easily be tempted to do one of these again in the future. So, thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and also subscribe to the channel, it really helps out. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits. If you want to become a member, I'd really appreciate that. I currently just have it so that for the top tiers you get ad-free videos, However, I will hopefully in the new year be adding some extra little features, or at least that's my plan. So I'm thinking in the future I'll be doing a fair few more inbox reviews, but maybe not necessarily building the kit, at least not immediately, because it's a little bit trickier to do a build video than it is to do an inbox review. And I also want to do some more stop motions as well, so it'll be a little bit of a case of sorting out where I go with that. Still working on the big project, Milne Bay. The script is still not written fully. It's sort of been taking a lot longer than I would have originally hoped, but oh well, that's with most things. But eventually I'll have a more official update on what's going on in terms of the kits being built and the planning for that kind of thing. But thanks for making it this far, and as always, take care and model on.